Thank you very much, Mayor. Now I understand where Leila Hundaya get their style from. I would like to call upon Joey to continue the case for the opposition.
You'll have blood on your hands. Blood on your hands, I say.
I totally missed that, but I appreciate it anyways.
Any examples of wars from before the Geneva Convention are completely irrelevant to our modern military policies. Since signing the Geneva Convention, we as a world have announced that we uphold a level of morality and that we are going to force others to uphold the same level of morality, and we are not going to simply target civilians. So there are two major clashes that I see as having happened today. The first one is the morality of negotiations, and the second one is what is the result of said negotiations. So, the morality of negotiating. The fact that these terrorist organizations do not fight their wars by our moral rules, by rules that we have established any moral country as having to have, even our enemies, even other countries that we are at war at, and afterwards negotiate, shows that they don't accept our moral ideology at all. Negotiations have to start with some agreement with some kind of basic agreement of what is right. And if we're negotiating with these organizations, no thank you, if we're negotiating with these organizations who don't accept our basic moral stances, then there's no way that we can possibly reach a moral conclusion.
But sir...
No thank you.
Information?
No thank you. Furthermore, as far as following the Geneva Convention, it is not actually in a single country's interest to follow the Geneva Convention as far as tactics go, as far as who's going to win the war. That's not the Nash equilibrium. It is in either side's interest to thus to not uphold said convention, and they will then have an advantage in war. But this is obviously not what we want. We want every country to uphold the Geneva Convention. And so even our enemies, we force to accept this convention by stating certain rules, the most basic of which is that if you do not follow the Geneva Convention, we are not going to negotiate with you. In order to maintain the state of the morality that we are trying to here uphold, we cannot accept those that defy the convention.
Sir.
No, thank you. So, to summarize the whole point of negotiating, which Team Proposition seemed to have missed, upholding the Geneva Convention is extremely important, and accepting countries that do not, or groups that do not uphold this convention, no thank you, is extremely damaging to us as a whole society. On to the second point of what happens, no thank you, when we have said negotiations. So, Team Proposition brought up a number of possible situations. The first one of which is that they'll obtain their goals, they'll obtain some of their goals, and they'll be afraid to, they'll have stuff that they care about and then be afraid to lose that stuff. Well, even before making initial agreements, terrorist organizations have things that they care about in their life. They're not completely destitute people with nothing to their name. They have families, they have things that they're not willing to give. And yet they still commit these acts of terror, and we say that conceding to their demands will still encourage them to further commit these acts of terror. For if the negotiations do not end with them completely renouncing terror, no thank you, then they will learn that acts of terror are a way to accomplish our goal. Furthermore, even if the negotiations result in them renouncing terror, all it's doing is showing other groups that if they were to commit terror, they could reach these same agreements and they could reach the same level of negotiations. Yes, please.
The job of a government is not to retrain terrorists and make them good. The job of a government is to protect its citizens and get the best that it can get.
Thank you. And when the government goes and announces to terrorist organizations that they are willing to negotiate, even if you have solved the current problem of the current terrorist organization, you are saying to other groups that they too can commit terror, and this will cause further harm to the citizen, even more harm than the initial groups, because you're telling them that we will continue to negotiate and that you can continue committing your acts of terror.
But sir,
yes, please.
You've completely disregarded our analysis of why terrorist groups won't grow in the first place if we negotiate with them.
One second. We disagree to that because your analysis was dependent on the fact that at some point that these terrorist organizations before we negotiate with them, have nothing to lose. Your analysis depended on the fact that once we've negotiated with them, these terrorists now have something that they're willing to lose, and so they will no longer commit these acts of terror. However, we say that they have stuff that they're not willing to lose even before initially negotiations, even before initially committing these acts of terror. And so by negotiating with them, and by showing them, no thank you, by showing them that they can obtain, that committing acts of terror obtains their goals and will increase their quality of life, we are in fact encouraging terror. So what have we shown you today? First off, negotiating is in and of itself harmful to us. We are showing that we accept countries, we accept organizations who do not uphold the Geneva Convention as legitimate, and these countries then have no reason to themselves uphold the Geneva Convention. We need to say to countries that are not willing to accept our moral stance that we are not willing to talk to them until they do so. Furthermore, negotiating with terrorists will show terrorists that terror works and will encourage the same groups to do further terror. And even if those groups happen to renounce terror, other groups will see that terror works, and they will know that committing terror is a way to obtain their goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joey. I would like to call upon for 4-minute summary speeches.
Yay.
What's your name?
Sergio.
Sorry?
Sergio.
Sergio. I remind you that there are no points of information during summary speeches.
Okay. Team Proposition made a couple of points. One was about saving human lives. One was about previous terror organizations that have negotiated and have reached some result. And they seem to have gotten confused about us thinking that negotiations are just a completely illegitimate fact. So we say, you're right, negotiations work. Negotiations work. The U.S. negotiated with Russia. Israel negotiated with Egypt. The U.S. is negotiating with North Korea. We're not saying that negotiation in and of itself is a bad thing, and that seems to be a point that you seem to think that we believe. We don't believe that at all. Negotiation works even when people disagree, okay? And that's the whole point of negotiation, is arguing and discussing and coming to terms with people you disagree with. Our point is that negotiation has to be on a level playing field. When one state discusses something with another state, they're trying to reach an agreement on a specific goal. When you're negotiating with terror, you're not negotiating on a level playing field. You're negotiating with a gun held to your head. The terrorist side has something that they've done to you or that they're threatening you with, okay? And your only recourse at that point in the negotiations is to give in. That's not negotiation. Negotiation isn't going into a meeting ahead of time saying, you win, I lose. That's not negotiation at all. The other thing is that you seem to claim that for some reason that negotiating with terrorism somehow cures terrorism, and it doesn't. Negotiation with terrorism leads to more terrorism. Once a terrorist gets what he wants, he realizes right away that, you know what, I did this and it worked. Okay, I killed people, they gave me prisoners. I blew up a bus, they get out of my country. And that just encourages other people or other terrorist groups to do the same thing, because they realize then that if you're willing to negotiate and say, you know what, if you don't blow up a bus, we'll do whatever, then that works. And that's completely legitimate. In terms of the whole morality of negotiation with terrorism, like we said, negotiation has to be on a level playing field. Once you're already committing an act of terror, you're already giving up your legitimacy. You're saying, we don't have something to argue with. We have to do something that's extreme and over the top in order to get you to argue. You gave examples of the IRA and the ANC and Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany, whether we want to, whether we agree with them or not, was a country. Whether they were doing something to their people, it was a legitimate government or an illegitimate government, but it was a government state actor that was committing a crime. The IRA, they didn't negotiate. Sorry, they negotiated with the Sinn Féin. The Sinn Féin was a political branch of the IRA that had already said that they were giving up terrorism. The ANC was negotiating with South Africa? South Africa had already been illegitimized by all the countries of the world, just about. So their government was already non-legitimate. So when you're already talking about state actors not negotiating with each other. So in conclusion, that's why I believe our side has the strength. We proved that negotiation with terrorism causes more terrorism. We proved that coming up with starting negotiations is already an unfair balance of power given to the terrorism, and you're giving them legitimacy by just arguing with them. And terrorism is already an immoral thing.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And to conclude today's debate, I would like to call upon Ayelet Eckstein.
So for proposition to pass a motion in a debate, it has to prove, first of all, that the motion is legitimate. Second of all, that the motion is effective. And third of all, that we're better off with this motion than without. And we have done all three of these things thoroughly and well. And I'm going to be explaining that to you in my speech. So first of all, let's see. Why is it legitimate for a government to negotiate with terrorists? So on our side of the house, we said that not only is it legitimate and it's a tool that we should be using, but furthermore, it's an obligation of the government to take every form of weapon against these terrorists that it can. And we've already told you that this form of weapon specifically has been so effective. It's been so helpful. So obviously we think that if a government has this option, then not only is it legitimate of the government to use it, we say that the government is obligated. And furthermore, we've already said that terrorism is part of modern warfare. We say, as our speakers have said during this debate, terrorism has become a way to fight a war in today's world. And although we love the Geneva Convention, we really do, we think that terrorism is something that we must combat in any possible way, including negotiation, and in some cases, especially with negotiating. So we say that terrorism is a modern warfare. It is part of the things that the government has an obligation to fight in order to protect its citizens. So we do think it's legitimate for this motion to stand. Now, why do we think this motion is effective? So to start off, we'd like to say that proposition has given you case after case after case of times when negotiation has prevented terrorism and has caused terrorist groups to become regular law-abiding citizens. Whereas the opposition hasn't shown us even one case where not negotiation has helped. So we say that that itself proves the fact that negotiation is effective. But furthermore, we've given you a clear analysis of why we think that terrorists have an agenda, and when we compromise with them, then they don't have an interest to go into terrorism because we've already given them what they want. So we say that it is effective to sit with terrorists and to deal with them. And we've shown you examples. And on side opposition, they said, well, if we talk with people who have different values than us and who don't agree with the Geneva Convention, so we can't really work things out. So first of all, we already told you that we can work things out. But furthermore, according to the opposition, no democratic country will ever negotiate with a non-democratic country. And we can't live with that. We don't see how opposition can stand saying that anybody who has different values can't sit at the same table and negotiate. Because the fact is, people negotiate only with people who differ from them. I won't negotiate with my best friend who agrees with me on everything because we agree. So we think that it is effective to negotiate. But furthermore, we don't really think that it works. We think that sometimes negotiation is better than any other form of weaponry because we see that in status quo. We've already stated examples, but furthermore, we've given analysis on how people, when they have something to lose, they don't turn to terrorism. We've already shown you that in Nazi Germany, which we don't think was a legitimate government, and we do think we should combat terrorism in Nazi Germany, but even not in a government. We say that even Palestinians in Israel or other terrorists in other countries, we think that the reason they go into terrorism in the first place is because they have nothing to lose. And we've given you analysis that hasn't been dealt with on side opposition. But furthermore, we say that we haven't heard any analysis from side opposition as to why talking to someone legitimizes him. We haven't heard as why when we talk to someone, we necessarily encourage other people to become terrorists. So at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen,